Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here this morning. I never get bored talking about ghosts or anything spooky and scary, and what better time than here in October. So we're kicking off the haunted month with a really neat topic: burial rites and wrongs, preventing the creation of the undead. What I'm going to do is take you through some different, well, just to give you the background, get you up to speed in terms of the basics with putting, it's an old joke, putting the fun in funeral, but it's not a fun thing. And I have to have a definite level of reverence and respect. So this is a sensitive topic, but at the same time, it's got a lot of superstition and a lot of traditions and protocols and things that need to be followed. So to give you just the basics first, inhumation, that's what's called when you inter a body into the earth. Now, what you're looking at there is the classic coffin. And there's two different things, and a lot of times people think it's interchangeable, but it's not. That is a coffin. The way you know it's a coffin is it has 6 sides. Its little nickname is called the toe pincher because the feet are placed in the part of the coffin that is at the bottom, where it's a little more narrow than the head and shoulders up top. What most people recognize is a casket. A casket only has 4 sides. Now, in Christian funerals, they usually consist of a wake and the funeral or a memorial service. And then there's a graveside gathering, and the body is then lowered, and that's the end. Sometimes they will take a shovel of dirt, and people put a shovel of dirt to symbolically really get their closure. It's their final goodbye to the passing of the loved one, and it gives them sense of closure. Now, in a Jewish tradition, their funerals, they have this urgency. Now, the Jewish tradition says the body must be buried within a day, 24 hours, but they will allow up to 3 days if there's family that has to come in from far away. But pretty much by the 3-day mark, the body must be interred. The other interesting thing is with the Jewish tradition, the mourners are the immediate family. So the mother, father, the siblings, the grandparents, that's the immediate family. They are all in black, and they remain in they're a very somber state. People that come to see them are called the comforters. And there's a whole process of sitting Shiva. So you get your body buried. In order to prepare the body, it may only be touched by a fellow Jew. It cannot be touched by a non-Jew. It has to be wrapped in this beautiful white shroud, which is called a takirim, I believe. I'm not very good at the pronunciation of it, but in any case, they want to get the body properly prepared, put into their casket. Well, and that's the other thing. They usually don't opt for a casket. They don't opt for embalming. That what makes theirs different is they believe the body needs to return to the earth. So they want a plain pine box. They don't want any embalming fluid in the body, and properly dressed in the shroud. And it's always a closed casket because I think it's nice. They believe that the body deserves respect and dignity and privacy. So once they have completed those things, the body is buried. The mourners will sit Shiva for 7 days. Comforters have appointed times they can come by. And it's interesting, like the mourners, they don't do their hair, makeup. I mean, it's not that they're not showered, but they just don't, they stay very plain and black because no bright colors, nothing vivid. They want to stay in the state of mourning, and not have any distraction by bright colors and makeup. And when people come to see them, they say, don't ask, like, how are you? Because it's pretty obvious they're not feeling great. They just lost their loved one. And don't say, I know how you feel, because how could you? You're not in their particular position. So they say, don't distract them with questions and statements like that. And what's interesting is it's such a stark contrast to the Irish tradition of, they will have their tears shed, definitely, and the body is interred, but, and they do their gravesite thing. But afterwards, it's more of a celebration. You know, they really have their whiskey and their fun, and you know, and it gets quite boisterous, but at the same time, you know, there's lots of food, lots of drink, and it's a plentiful celebration of the person. So it's quite different. The other thing with the Jewish tradition is they will not put a headstone on. They wait a whole year, and then on the anniversary, the 1 year anniversary, is when the headstone will be put in place. Other traditions and different ways of putting the body, you know, after it's deceased, is this one. It's an interesting looking thing, a sarcophagus. That's more in your tradition of Egyptian. So they would have the mummified remains. So before we have the modern day morticians who do the embalming, the Egyptians were your original embalmers. They had a very precise approach to how they did their whole mummification in terms of getting out the organs and putting in a little cop tie and getting the brain out basically through the nasal cavity, and not very pleasant, and steeping the body and, you know, wrapping it in different cloths dripped. I guess it was some type of salt solution. They were trying to almost in a way dehydrate it. So that's a sarcophagus. That's another form of interment. Now, actually, that wouldn't really be interred because that means in the earth. They were pretty much put in their own little mausoleums, which we'll get to. This is a mort safe. Now, the mort safe, at a time in dark time during history, graves were being robbed. People knew that, well, you know, they buried this guy and he had all his, you know, different rings, or the wife had her jewelry on, so they would rob the grave. So a mort safe was put over it to prevent a grave robber. But it's made of iron, so it would also prevent, in the unhopeful event that someone became undead, the iron prevents them from getting out. It holds them safely in the ground. And then there's the mausoleum. Now, the mausoleum is an above ground burial building. It holds urns, and it can hold coffins and caskets as well. In New Orleans, this is like a standard operating procedure. They have the cities of the dead. The New Orleans is like at or below parts of its sea level. So when it rains or they get a storm, the bodies were all coming up out of the ground, and it was not pleasant seeing them floating down the street. So they have their cities of the dead. So everybody is in a mausoleum. I found this picture, and even though it doesn't really, it's not typically how we would, you know, do a burial. This is a woman, believe it or not, from 490 BC. So I just wanted to include it because it's a pretty interesting thing that happened. You know, like in Pompeii, you had some of the people with the volcanic ash that were mummified in position. In her case, she was in a bog. And the anaerobic conditions of the bog actually preserved her body so perfectly. And now she lies in state in this glass covered open casket of sorts. And it's she was discovered in 1835, but they were able to settle disputes about her age and the identity and everything in 1977, when they were able to do radiocarbon dating. And that's when they placed it about 5th century BC. Not only was her skeleton fully intact, but the skin and the internal organs were as well. So it's an amazing find. It's her body lies in state in this ornate glass covered sarcophagus. Excuse me, it is a sarcophagus inside the St. Nikolai Church, and that's in Denmark. So places, when I say interred, getting put into the earth. Your typical one is a cemetery. Cemeteries are not on church ground. They are their own separate park and their own separate place, and the bodies are interred there. This is what makes it different from a graveyard. Now, graveyards are specifically on church property. And cemeteries can be religious, where they only have their own particular religious followers buried there. And then there can be non-denominational cemeteries. Graveyards, typically it's someone who is a member of the church is buried in their graveyard. Now, the word cemetery actually comes from the Latin comeritium or comeritarium. Sorry, I'm terrible at these pronunciations. And basically, that kind of stems from the ancient Greek, which equals bedroom or resting place. And originally, these were freestanding, multi-roomed early Christian grave sites, and bodies were buried in wall niches as well as under the floor. What's known as a cenotaph, that is a grave where there's no body buried in it. Now, I show you the picture here of young Bobby Driscoll. He was a child star actor. He actually won an Academy Award at the age of 9 when he was starring in at the age of 9, I'm sorry, he was starring in the movie Song of the South, a Disney production. And in 1950, when he was 12 years old, that's when he won an Oscar award. And he also was the voice of Peter Pan in Disney's animated movie, Peter Pan. He did that voice when he was 16 years old. It's somewhat tragic about Bobby. He pretty much was kicked to the curb by Disney Studios as he got into his teen years. He developed a bad case of acne, and I forget, it was one of those. Howard Hughes actually purchased the studio, and he just didn't like child star actors. So he basically had Bobby fired, his contract dismissed. And after that, Bobby fell on hard times. He ended up in New York City, addicted to heroin. And the sad part of it is that's what killed him. He had hardening of the arteries, and he died in 1968 in a tenement somewhere in New York City. And it was actually 2 children that found his lifeless body laying on a cot, and they called for the police, and nobody knew who he was. He had no identification on him. So he actually ended up buried on Hart Island out in the Bronx. And that's a potter's field in New York City. And years later, when his mother was trying desperately to find him, and they were coming up with on the anniversary with Disney Studios of 50 years of the movies and stuff, she asked Disney Studios to help her. So they assigned actually a detective, and the detective was able to trace everything down and said, well, your son is buried on Hart Island, and she lives out in California, and she couldn't afford to have the body exhumed and have the remains transported to California. So that's why she opted for this cenotaph. So that way her son is remembered on the same stone where her husband is, his namesake. So that's a cenotaph. The body is not there, but the tombstone is. So now you want to prevent the creation of vampires. Who doesn't, right? And there are some key things that you have to be mindful of. Now, mirrors, definitely. Mirrors can act as portals, with different discarnate spirits can kind of zap from mirror to mirror. And you don't want that to happen. When you have a dead body, a corpse, you don't want it to see its reflection in a mirror. So basically, you are going to cover every single mirror in the house or in the funeral home with a black cloth. Now, this also, it prevents the unrest. It's not a good idea. You definitely want the mirrors covered so that the person does not see the reflection and become a vampire. Then the Greek tradition, or Greek lore, there's this candle called an isu, and that is made and lit after the person dies. They will make this candle and place it in the navel or the belly button of the corpse. And they kind of honor this for 40 days and so forth. That's their lore. Some traditions will make the candle and just place it in the corpse's hands and have it lit. And they want to show the light. It's lighting the way. So that way the soul doesn't get confused and come back to its body and then end up being vampiric in nature. They want to light the way to the afterlife. Oh, I don't know what just happened. Bear with me. Okay. Sorry about that little blip. So the other thing you want to do with a corpse is keep the mouth closed, or you can stuff it. In some cases, people will stuff the mouth with garlic or gold coins, crosses, dirt, anything to keep it from becoming a vampire. And the reason is if the corpse can somehow start to chew and start chewing on itself, that's a form of vampirism. So you want to sew the mouth shut or stuff it with different things. The other thing you never want to do, and this was more of an issue when they used to do wakes in the home, like in the front family parlor. But, you know, I know it's funny. It says, would you please pass the jelly? But you don't pass anything over or under the person lying in state. It will cause the vampirism. You don't want your kitty cats. They're famous for running under things or jumping up and over things. So you want to make sure no animals go over or under the corpse as well, because that kind of condemns it to being a vampire. The other thing you can do is if you suspect this person that just died may turn into a vampire, bury them face down. The reason is with the corpse begins to wake up and come to its vampiric life, it'll be facing down and won't be able to find its way out. And if it tries to escape, it'll just be digging and just going further into the ground. The other thing you can do is bury the body at a crossroads. Crossroads have a lot of paranormal and superstitious implications, but in this case, burying a body on unhallowed ground at a crossroads actually traps it from wandering among the living. So that's a big help. You can stake the body, and by that, take the wooden stakes. Now, this is classic, always drive it through the heart, but typically you would drive the stakes at the shoulder points, like pinning it at the shoulders, once through the heart and then once through the feet, and that should prevent it from coming up. Some cases, they would actually slit the tendons behind the knees and in the wrists and so forth, so that the person would not have the ability, the vampire to use its legs or its hands. And in extreme cases, they would actually remove the limbs and scatter bury them. So that way the corpse has no way of reassembling itself and coming back to walk among the living. Now, in Germanic lore, it's not so funny. And what that means is they found in order to contain a vampire, now this wouldn't prevent it from happening and it wouldn't forever contain it, but it bought you a lot of time because vampires, believe it or not, have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. They have to do everything in the same methodical fashion. And they have, if you throw a bunch of seeds down, actually, that's a good way to escape one. Always keep like loose change or seeds and stuff in your pockets, because if you throw that on the ground and you take off, they can't help it. They have to stop and count every single thing. So it will buy you some time to get away. Now, getting to the buying you some time, in the Germanic lore, they used to put a knotted net over a body that they suspected may come back as a vampire. And the reason being that the vampire, if it's true, if it turns to a vampire while in the ground, can only untie one of those knots per year. So depending on how many knots, you've got a plenty of time. You won't have to see this creature. Some people would put poppy seeds in with the body because it actually has a narcotic effect on the corpse, making it sleep. And then sometimes they would have a to-go meal of sorts. They would put in a different foods and things. So that way, if it was going to turn to a vampire, hopefully it would just eat the food it was given and not fully vampirize and start to walk the earth and go after other people, human people, living people. And of course, they would throw in maybe some money and things like, here's your toll tokens for Chiron. Just get over the river Styx. Don't come back as a vampire. What's interesting too is this sharper image effect. Now, in some traditions, I thought this was kind of cool. They would take, if you see that sickle, some traditions, they would actually place the sickle over the throat of the corpse. So that way, if it did wake up and it's buried face up and it goes to sit up, the sickle would cut and basically decapitate it. So there you go. You don't have to worry about it being a vampire, because that's the number one way to off them, is to decapitate them. In other traditions, they believed, just do the funeral pyre, completely burn it. And what they did think is, like, it's kind of gross, but taking some of the ashes after the body was burned, they found that it would cure the severely ill. Now that's just a superstition. I don't know how much, stock I put in that. The other type of undead, which is a little strange, is the Doppelsauger. Now, you've heard of the doppelganger. That's like the ghostly vision of yourself, like a spirit or something that walks around that looks like you, but it's not you. Or they say everybody has a double on the planet and so forth. But a Doppelsauger is actually a double sucker. And that's a vampire that's created, believe it or not, when a mother doesn't wean her child early enough. If she has long been breastfeeding long after an age that, really requires it, the child is going to grow up, and when it dies, become a vampire. What's really gross, is you'll notice, is their lips don't decay. That's a telltale sign that they have turned into a vampire. You can prevent it if you suspect the Doppelsauger will, once they're coming close to death, the best thing to do is put a gold coin in their mouth. You can also put what they call like a crescent piece of wood under the chin of the corpse before it's buried. That way, as long as the chin and the mouth never get to touch their clothing or start to chew their own flesh. They say the other thing you'll notice, they actually eat their own like breast tissue, and it's awful. But in any event, that's, when it's turning into a Doppelsauger. But if you put that crescent piece of wood, it keeps the mouth shut and they can't do that. And even still, sometimes these things still happen, even if you've taken these precautions. So what will happen is they will begin to vampirize their family members. So immediate family members will first notice that they are suspiciously losing weight and quickly. They're getting very sick. So at that point, they realize, this, Aunt so-and-so definitely became a Doppelsauger. So the way to solve that, and according to the Slavic tradition, is you go to the grave and you dig up the body. All the immediate family members have to be there. They must dig up the body and take a spade and chop off the back of its neck. When you hear this horrific scream, yes, it definitely was this Doppelsauger that was making us sick, and now it's dead for good. So interesting vampire of the Slav story there. Now, revenants, not many people talk about these, and it's weird. We all focus on, vampires, zombies, the monster du jour, but the revenants, they're a real deal. And I think they happen a lot more than people, even realize. It comes from the French word revenir, which means to return. Now, this can happen to a human or an animal. And they can appear as a filmy ghost or even as solid as you and I, okay? In Irish lore, revenants manifest just briefly to attend their funeral party. They get to party one last time, and then that's it. But other traditions, what makes them is having their body not handled with care. So at the time of death, if they weren't properly prepared for burial, or even the animal wasn't properly prepared for burial, the revenant comes forth. It's if they weren't buried at all, you can have it in a case, let's say with a plane crash, and the bodies were flown, far and wide, thrown far and wide, and they weren't properly buried. And some of those people finally wake up and they're not dead, they're not alive, they're a revenant. They've come back, and they tend to roam around, because they weren't buried properly. They tend to be exceedingly jealous of the living, so you have to look out for that. Some of them come back because they were very sinful in their life and they're trying to make up for it. Some of them have unfinished business and they recognize that. They want to get things completed. For the most part, a revenant is not harmful to the living, except in the case of a witch's curse. Now, if a witch curses a person and they die and come back as a revenant, that revenant usually is very harmful because under the witch's curse, she's going to be basically pulling the strings and making him or her do things that are not too pleasant. Sometimes, like again with the plane crash, a violent sudden death or suicide. In suicide cases, sometimes the person doesn't get it right away and they may linger from their attempted suicide until it actually takes hold. And then they're a revenant because they're coming back because they're still thinking that they just didn't do it right, even though, yes, you did, you succeeded, you're dead, but they don't get it. And if you're killed by a vampire, now this is interesting because we all know from the movies, oh, they suck your blood and they suck every ounce of it out of you, you're dead. But if they only suck so much, it's your chance to turn. And you know, in the lore, you have to feed within so many hours of the vampire bite and you'll turn and become a vampire. Great. But in the Revenant's case, they had so much blood sucked, but they weren't left for truly dead and they didn't turn truly to a vampire. So they're in this tween state of a revenant. Ghouls, pretty gross part of, of paranormal and graveyard creatures. They are nocturnal creatures. They're marked by long fingernails because they're usually digging their way out of their graves and rising from their graves. They're found in lonely places like cemeteries and graveyards, even ruins, ancient ruins. Sometimes the ghouls will hang out in. And typically they will feast upon the flesh of the dead, but they also will, you know, if an errant child or traveler, someone who's not going to be missed, happens to be in their turf, you know, their cemetery or graveyard, they will feast on them as well. Excuse me. In Babylonian and Assyrian lore, there's Lamaya, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Forgive me if I'm not, but she is from a goddess, the mistress of Zeus, actually, and she angered Hera. Zeus's wife was very upset when she learned of Zeus and Lamaya's affair. So basically, you know, she killed. No, I'm sorry. Oh, that's right. They had Lamaya. Let me get this straight because these names are so confusing. Lamaya and Hera had an affair. No, Lamaya and Zeus had an affair, and a child was born of that. And Hera was angered, his wife, so she killed the baby. And after that, this creature decided she would go after all other babies being born, and she would drink their blood and consume their flesh. Now, in Islamic lore, you have Lilith. Lilith is known as the long-haired winged female demon. She drinks the blood of men to produce demon sons, you know, by basically newly married men. She will drink their blood to produce demon sons. Now, in the lore, it says she is the mother of jinn, which are genies. Basically, she's the first wife of Adam. Instead of Adam and Eve, originally it was Adam and Lilith. And Lilith was like, no, I'm equal to Adam. And Adam was like, no, you're not. And so she took off. 3 angels were sent to bring her back, and she refused to go back. So God punished her by killing 100 of her demon babies every day. So she retaliated by going after the children and so forth. And basically, if you want to protect your young-born child from her, you always keep an amulet with the 3 angels' names on it. And she also attacks pregnant women when they're going into labor. So those women would wear the amulet with the angels' names on it as well to protect them. So, and she has over 1,000 different names. You can kind of cast her aside if you use one of her names. In terms of general ghoul protection, Iron nails in doorways, very simple. Scissors. Now, scissors, in addition, I go for more the amulet with the angels' names on it. That's for Lilith. But to protect from Lilith and Lamaye and ghouls in general for your newborn baby, they say put scissors on top of the bassinet. I don't think that's all that safe. If the scissors were to fall, that could be catastrophic, but that is what they suggest in terms of the general protection from ghouls. Now, another undead creature, the Windigo. Now, this harkens from Native American Indian lore. It's a cannibalistic creature, and it's usually in the dense woods and forests. Typically, it is the result of hunters going into the woods hunting, and they get lost, and they are forced to cannibalism, and they end up turning into these very large, like towering 15 feet ghoul-like beasts. And what's striking is they have this white star in their forehead. Now, some people, believe it or not, intentionally want to become Windigos. For whatever reason, they've given up on life as we know it, and they make their way into the woods, and they hope to come upon a Windigo, because if the Windigo gets you, well, then it can hurt you enough to turn you into one, or or you just will cannibalize somebody coming by and you'll turn into one. Now, there are ways to be protected. You can get a shaman's blessing, and that will protect you from them. And there's ways to vanquish them. So you can, if you kill it, you can kill it and dismember its body parts and burn all the body parts separately. The other thing that's a lot easier, if you have silver bullets, that will take it out. They work on werewolves too, but that's a different presentation in any event. With the Windigo, yes, you can use silver bullets or you can kill it. They say if you're attacked by one and you want to get away, that if you throw your own feces at it, it will definitely deter it and give you enough time to get away. And I can't say anything further on that because it is a disturbing thing, but I guess in that situation, one could manifest the feces required to protect oneself and escape. Now, there's other best practices. These include washing of the body. Now, when I was talking before about proper burial and proper preparation, some people will wash the body with soap and water. Other cultures believe in washing it in wine, and that it purifies the body and it protects it against a demon takeover. The dead person's clothes must be changed and taken out, okay? You want to get them out of the house. Now, in the case of Mr. Sarcophagus, I don't know if you ever saw this. This is an old movie, but his father-in-law was actually, or no, it was his father. Yes, his father was buried in the father's waistcoat, which was like a vest. And in the vest pocket was the lottery ticket. And Mr. Sarcophagus and his wife realized that's where the ticket that won is buried. And the wife's like, you got to go dig him up. You got to get that ticket out of his waistcoat. And he goes back and he digs his father's grave up and he opens it and the moonlight shines on it. And he's so horrified, it froze his face in that awful position that you see there, which is why he changed his name to Sarcophagus for a sardonic smile. Anyway, that's why that's a nice example of why you want to get the clothes changed and just put fresh, clean clothes on and bury the person properly. Tolls may be encountered in some traditions, so you would want to weigh down the corpse's eyelids with coins so they have something to pay the toll to cross over. And this is interesting. You're going to stop the clocks. Stopping all the clocks in the house until the corpse is properly buried will suspend its consciousness and keep it safe from demonic attack until it's properly buried. So that's a good thing to do. When you want to take the corpse out of the house, you're going to go feet first out the back door. And that's why they're in, like you see in the one picture, that's a corner niche. Some houses, the staircases were kind of narrow. So they would put those little niches in. They could take the statue out, and that would give just enough room to bank the coffin in and make the turn and come down the stairs. I did forget to mention about the door sill. Speaking of taking a body out feet first from the back door, but with the Doppelsauger, you want to take the door sill, the front door, and you want to take the door sill, lift it up and put it at the top, bring the body out feet first, then take the door sill back down and secure it, because a Doppelsauger, if it comes back to the house, it has to go in the exact same way it came out, and it won't be able to because the door sill will now be on the bottom instead of the top. So forgot to tell you that earlier. I apologize. Now, the other thing that's interesting is when you want to get the body to the graveyard, you have to go the way the sun travels, east to west. That's the best way to get the body to the grave. So that way it completes that cycle of sunrise to sunset, the birth to death. And it's very symbolic, but that's your best bet to get the body there. You go from east to west in the graveyard. The other thing that in Greek lore is done, usually 3 years after the body has been interred, they will exhume the body and cleanse the bones. Now, they go by the bone color, and in the Greek lore, if the bones are very light in color, that signifies a very peaceful soul. They're at rest. If the bones are darkly colored, that's the presence of sin. So in that case, much prayers are needed to clear the sin and get the soul to go to peace. And where that corner niche picture is, that's the Bartow Pell Mansion out in the Bronx, New York. So I just wanted to give you a picture to show you that, yes, that's an actual corner niche, and that's the mansion where I took the picture. Zombies. Now, the origin of the concept of zombieism stems from Haitian voodoo culture. The word zombie in Haitian is zombai, and it means spirit of the dead. And, excuse me, Bokors, or voodoo priests who practice black magic, and they can possess the ability to resurrect the deceased through the administration of a powder called coupadre. Now, this powder primarily consists of an ingredient known as tetrodotoxin. It's a deadly substance derived from the notoriously poisonous fufu, or porcupine fish. The poison slows the heart rate so much that it appears to have stopped beating. The breath rate is greatly subdued, and the body temperature is significantly decreased. Once the body is discovered in this state, the unsuspecting family members think their loved one is dead, and they bury the body. Then later, the Bokor will show up, and he will exhume the corpse, and he claims total control over this now zombified state corpse, because this toxin actually erases the memory. So the person has no memory. It is just basically a zombie. It's on autopilot, completely controlled by the Bokor. Now, they say the way you can revert it back or get rid of the zombie is to feed it salt or throw salt on the body, or that once the Bokor dies, that pretty much releases the zombie, and it just collapses, and then that's it. It's the end of it. It's interesting to note that there's some of these in South African tradition. Witches can turn a person into a zombie by killing and possessing the victim's body in order to force it into slave labor. And there's these things called witch trains. And after rail lines were built to transport migrant workers, stories emerged about these witch trains. These trains appeared ordinary, but were staffed by zombie workers, and they were controlled by the witch who set up this train. And basically, people would be abducted when boarding at night, and the person would then either be turned into a zombie or beaten and thrown from the train at a distance from the original location. And this was all under the control of this witch controlling this witch train full of zombies. So interesting. Thankfully, I mean, you know, in New Jersey Transit, it can be scary in some stations, but luckily no witch trains, that they're all pretty up and up. And that is the dead end. So I thank you so much for stopping in today and seeing the presentation on the burial rights and wrongs. That's the website, njghs.net, if you want to visit New Jersey Ghost Hunter Society. We do have monthly meetings. You don't have to be a member to attend the meetings. You do have to be a member to get your base training if you want to be on a private investigative team where we teach you how to do a paranormal investigation. Our investigations are always free of charge, and we're all about the research. So if you have any need for an investigation, again, there's the website. You can go to the Who's Who page and get my email and email me that you need an investigation. I'm glad to help. I can always dispatch a team. So again, I thank you so much for your time and attention today. And if Sarah has any questions from anybody that she wants to give to me, that'd be great.